Hi, I'm going to be reading the fourth chapter of the Geography of You and Me. By the time they made it back up all the flights of stairs, red-faced and panting and holding their sides, the apartment was like an oven, and there was nothing to do but collapse onto the cool tiles of the kitchen floor. There was no cure for this kind of heat, no fans and no air conditioning, and no breeze from the window. And even the ceramic tiles grew warm beneath them as they lay there in silence, still breathing hard. Eventually, Owen sat up and reached for one of the water bottles, handing another over to Lucy, who was sprawled out beside the refrigerator. Her white dress pulled all around her. She wiped at her forehead with the back of her hand, then propped herself up on her elbows to take a sip. "That's it," she said when she was done. Owen lay back again. "What is?" "I'm never going downstairs again. Until the elevator's fixed." "Maybe not even then," she said. "That elevator and I go way back, but after tonight, I'm not sure I can ever trust it again." Poor old elevator. Poor old me. There was a ceiling fan above them, and Owen stared at the outline of the blades through the dark for so long that he could almost imagine it spinning. His whole body was spiky with heat, even his eyelids, which felt heavy and thick. He reached absently for the flashlight on the floor between them, then clicked on it, shining it around the kitchen like a spotlight, circling the sink and zigzagging across the cabinets. "There's pretty much nothing in there. My mom doesn't cook," Lucy said, following the beam with her gaze. "None of us really do." "That's too bad," he said. "You've got a great kitchen." "Do you? Have a great kitchen?" "No," she said, lying back again so that their heads were inches apart, their bodies fanned out in opposite directions. "Do you cook?" "Yep," he said, "and I clean too. I'm a regular Renaissance man." He flicked the light over the dishwasher, then the oven, and finally up to the refrigerator, which was covered with postcards, each one pinned by a brightly colored magnet. He sat up to take a closer look, focusing the light so he could read the names scrawled over them. Florence, Cape Town, Prague, Barcelona, Cannes, St. Petersburg. "Wow," he said. "Have you been to all of these places?" Lucy laughed. "Do you think I'm sending myself postcards?" "No," he said, his face burning. "I just figured. They're from my parents. They go to amazing places, and I get a piece of cardboard," she explained with a shrug. "It's kind of a tradition. They always bring one of my brothers a magnet and the other a snow globe. Apparently, I asked for a postcard once when I was little, and I guess it sort of stuck." He scooted closer to the refrigerator, holding the flashlight in his fist. "So where are they now?" "Paris," she said. "They go there all the time." "They don't ever take you?" he asked, without turning around, and her voice behind him was quiet when she answered. "No." "Oh," he said, sitting back on his heels. "Well, who needs Paris when you live in New York, right?" This made her smile. "I guess so," she said, then pointed at the fridge. "I haven't gotten one from this trip yet. That's actually why I was downstairs before. I was checking the mail." There was a note of sadness in the words, and Owen cast around for something to say in response, something to fill the quiet of the kitchen. He glanced again at the mosaic of photographs. "Postcards are overrated anyway." "Oh yeah?" she asked, raising her eyebrows. "Yeah. I mean, what's the worst you can say to someone who isn't on some beautiful beach with you?" Lucy shrugged. "Wish you were here?" He rapped his knuckles against a scene from Greece, which was hanging near the bottom. "I mean, come on. If they really wished you were there, they'd have invited you. They'd have invited you in the first place, right? It's kind of mean if you really think about it. It should say, Greece, where nobody's all that upset you're not here." There was a long pause, and as silence lengthened, he realized his mistake. He'd only been joking, but it had come out sounding harsh and somehow too specific, and he was gripped now with a sudden fear that he managed to make things worse. But to his relief, she began to laugh. "Rome, where it's so beautiful we've pretty much forgotten about you," she said, sitting up. Her arms were looped around her bare legs, and her mouth was twisted with the humor of it. "Sydney, where you're really missing out." "Exactly," Owen said. "That's a lot more honest, anyway." "I guess you're right," she said, her face growing serious again. "But I bet your parents really do wish you were there." "Yeah," she said, but her voice was hollow. I bet. He switched off the flashlight, then pivoted so that his back was against the refrigerator, the postcards fluttering above his head, and he thought of the notes his mother used to leave for him around the house. Little yellow post-its, scrawled with blue ink, reminders to clean his room or to heat up the casserole she'd made. Sometimes she left them before running out to do errands or going to dinner with Dad. But other times she wouldn't be far, just out in the backyard, weeding the garden. It didn't matter whether she'd see him again in 2 minutes or 2 hours or 2 days. The notes always ended the same way. Thinking of you. I have an idea, he said, and Lucy let her head fall to one side so she could look at him. Her eyes dark and searching. He reached into his pocket and held out the keys to the roof. It'll be a hike, he told her, but I think it'll be worth it. They loaded a backpack with water and snacks, candles and a blanket, and then Owen led them back toward the hallway, flashlight held before him like a sword. The hallway was still quiet, and he wondered what he'd be doing now if his father were home. He would probably just be waiting while his father went door to door through the building, pretending as best as he could at his new role of caretaker. As Owen sat alone in the basement, pretending not to notice that his dad could hardly even take care of himself these days. They started up the stairs at a brisk pace, but their footsteps soon slowed, and by the time they passed the 35th floor, they were walking side by side, hauling themselves up on opposite railings, one sweaty hand at a time. When they finally reached the metal door at the top, Owen gave it a push, but it didn't budge. A lot of the time they leave it unlocked, he explained, which is why I don't feel too bad about the key. Aha, she said. So you're not as much of a badass as you first appear, he laughed. I'm not a badass at all. I'm just a guy with a key. When he unlocked the door, they stumbled out onto the darkened roof, their eyes focused on the ground as they picked their way across the tar-covered surface. Over there, Owen said, pointing at the southwest corner, and Lucy walked over to the ledge that ran along the perimeter where she stood looking out. Wow, she breathed, rising onto her tiptoes. Owen dropped the backpack before joining her, positioning himself a few inches away. The wind lifted her hair from her shoulders, and he caught a scent of something sweet. It smelled like flowers, like springtime, and it made him a little dizzy. They were quiet as they took in the unfamiliar view, the island that was usually lit up like a Christmas tree, now nothing but shadows. The skyscrapers were silhouettes against a sky the color of a bruise, and only the spotlight from a single helicopter swung back and forth like a pendulum as it drifted across the skyline. Together they leaned against the granite wall, invisible souls in an invisible city, peering down over 42 stories of sheer height and breathless altitude. I can't believe I've never been up here, she murmured, without taking her eyes off the ghostly buildings. I always say the best way to see the city is from the ground up, but this place is amazing. It's a million miles above the rest of the world, he said, shifting to her face more fully. A million miles away from the world, she said, which is even better. You're definitely living in the wrong city then. Not really, she said, shaking her head. There are so many ways to be alone here, even when you're surrounded by this many people. Owen frowned. Sounds lonely. She turned to him with a smile, but there was something steely about it. There's a difference between loneliness and solitude. He was about to say more, but was reminded of the postcards just downstairs. Dozens of monuments to one or the other, loneliness or solitude, depending on how you looked at them. Then I guess you've come to the right place, he said, watching her fingers drum in unconscious rhythm on the stone of the ledge, even though you're not technically alone at the moment. No, that's true, she said, fixing her gaze on him again, and this time the smile was real. They spread the picnic blanket on the uneven surface of the roof, then spilled out the contents of the backpack. The sun was long gone, but it was still warm out, even up here, where the wind made it difficult to light the candles. After a while, they gave up and dined in the dark instead, sharing an assortment of cookies and crackers and fruits, and Lucy's eyes kept straying back to the sky between bites, as if she couldn't trust the unfamiliar stars to stay put. When they were full, they dragged the blanket over to the wall so that they could lean against it, sitting side by side, their heads tilted back, their shoulders nearly touching. "If you could go anywhere in the world, where would it be?" Lucy asked, and Owen felt a flash of recognition. It was a question that was always on his mind, and the first thing he usually wondered about other people, even if he never got around to asking. "Everywhere," he said, and she laughed, the sound light and musical. "That's not an answer." "Sure it is," he said, because it was true, possibly the truest thing about him. Sometimes it seemed as if his whole life was an exercise in waiting, not waiting to leave, exactly, but simply waiting to go. He felt like one of those fish that had the capacity to grow in unimaginable ways, if only the tank were big enough. But his tank had always been small, and as much as he loved his home, as much as he loved his family, he'd always felt himself bumping up against the edges of his own life. New York City wasn't the answer. What Owen wanted was something wider, something vaster. He had applications ready for 6 different colleges that ranged up and down the West Coast, from San Diego all the way up to Washington, and he couldn't wait for the day when he could take off and start a new life out there, crossing through states heavy with vowels beneath skies flat as paper, through the impossible bulk of jagged mountains all the way to the silvery ocean. For as long as he could remember, he'd felt the pull of the road, an itinerant streak that chimed from somewhere deep inside him, perhaps inherited from his once restless parents. One day he hoped to find their kind of peace too, a home that was nothing special until they deemed it so, but that would come later, and for now there were thousands of places he burned to see, and next year would be just the start of it. He could feel Lucy's eyes on him, and when he turned to face her, she dipped her chin. "Okay then," she said, matter-of-factly, "everywhere." "What about you?" he asked, and she considered this a moment. "Somewhere," he grinned. "How is that a better answer than everywhere?" "It's more specific," she said, as if this should be obvious. "I guess that's true." He looked down at his folded hands. "You know, I've never really been anywhere. New York, obviously, and Pennsylvania. We went to the Delaware shore once when I was little, and crossed through New Jersey a few times. That's what, 4 states?" He shook his head and smiled ruefully. "Pitiful, huh?" "What about next year?" she asked. "College seems like a pretty good excuse to get out of here." "It is," he agreed. "I'm looking for a lot of places out west. California, Oregon, Washington." She raised her eyebrows. "Those are really far." "Yeah," he said. "That's kind of the point. They've all got pretty good science programs, too." "Ah," she said, "so you are a science whiz." He shrugged. "Whiz might be taking it a bit far. What about your dad?" "What about him?" Owen asked, but he knew what she meant, and he felt something go cold in his chest at the thought. There were so many parts of this lonely next chapter that he dreaded now, most of them having to do with his mother, that she wouldn't be there to watch him walk across the stage at graduation, or to help him pack, or to make the bed in his new dorm room the way she always did at home. But the worst of it was actually this, that after dropping off his only son, his dad would have to come back to this miserable basement apartment on his own. That was the part that knocked the wind out of him every single time. He swallowed hard and raised his eyes to meet Lucy's. Won't he miss having you nearby?" she asked, and he forced himself to shrug. "He'll come visit," he said with as much confidence as he could muster. He felt beside him where there was a small piece of gravel, and then used it to scratch absently at the black surface of the roof. "What about you?" "Will I miss having you nearby?" she asked with a grin, and he smiled in spite of himself. "No," he said. "Tell me where you've been." "Well, New York, of course," she said, holding out a hand to tick off her fingers as she counted. "Connecticut, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Florida. I was hoping to get to California when my brothers left for school a few weeks ago, but they ended up just driving out together. My cousin's getting married there in a few months, though, so I guess I'll be able to add it to the list then." "Pretty good list," he said with a nod. "Oh, and London," she said, her face brightening. "Almost forgot about that. Just twice, though. It's where my mom's from, so." She shrugged. "But that's it for me. Not at all that impressive either. He sighed. When my parents graduated from high school, they bought a van and saw the whole country. 2 years on the road. They went everywhere. I'm more interested in going abroad, she said, her voice unmistakably wistful. I want to see all the places on those postcards, especially Paris. Why Paris? I don't know, she said. All those beautiful buildings and cathedrals. You mean all those postcards? Yeah, she admitted. All those postcards. They're very selling. What do you want to see the most? Notre Dame, she said without hesitation. Why, he asked, expecting to hear something about the architecture or the history or at least the gargoyles. But he was wrong. Because, she said, it's the very center of Paris. It is? She nodded. There's a little plaque with a star in front of it that marks the spot, point zero. And if you jump on it and make a wish, it means you'll get a chance to go back there someday. There's something kind of magical about that, don't you think? It'd be nice if every place came with that kind of guarantee. He leaned over to draw an X between them with the piece of gravel. Then he rubbed it out with the heel of his hand and replaced it with a crooked star. Does that mean we're in the exact center of New York? She asked, nodding at it, and he felt momentarily unsteady beneath her gaze. I think, he said quietly, that we're in the exact center of the whole world. She held out a flattened palm and it took a moment for him to realize that she was asking for the rock, not his hand. He passed it over and she drew a circle around the edges of the star, then scratched the words point zero along the outside. There, she said. Now it's official. See? No need for Paris. Not for tonight anyway, she said, handing back the stone, but I'd still like to go. How come they never took you along? She shrugged. I don't know. I guess it's hard to travel with 3 kids. My brothers are awesome, but they're twins, and when we were little, they were complete nightmares. The first time we went to London, I remember them running up and down the aisles of the plane, locking themselves in the bathroom. There was a hint of a smile on her face, but then she shook her head. That's not really it, though. The thing is, I think my parents just really like traveling alone together. Alone together, Owen said. Oxymoron. You're an oxymoron, she said, rolling her eyes. But really, it's always been their thing. It's partly his job, but they also just really love it. Some people shop, some people fish. My parents travel. What does he do? He works for this British bank. They met in London, but he's had jobs in all these other places too. Sydney and Cape Town and Rio. When my brothers were born, he took a job in the New York office, since he's from here, and I think the plan was to settle down, but that part never really took. Instead, they were always just jetting off and leaving us with the nanny. Sounds glamorous. For them, she said, but I would have loved to go too. I still would. She swept a hand through the air, scattering a few mosquitoes. Sometimes I think they liked their lives a whole lot better before they had kids. Owen thought of his own parents putting down roots the moment they found out they were pregnant. It's probably not that it was better, he said, just different. My parents did the same thing, settling down when I came along, and they were happy. He paused, blinking fast. We were all happy. Lucy was sitting with her arms resting on her knees, and when she turned to look at him, her leg bumped against his. Right then he had the sudden urge to inch closer to her, to close the space between them, and the force of it surprised him. It felt like a very long time since he'd wanted anything at all. I'm sorry, she said, reaching over to put a hand over his. About your mom. The warmth of her palm cracked at something inside him, that hard shell of a hurt that had formed over his heart like a coat of ice. She was watching him intently, her eyes seeking his, but he couldn't bring himself to look at her, because the numbness was the only thing keeping him going, the only thing preventing him from falling into pieces, in front of his dad, who was falling into pieces enough for the both of them. He turned his eyes back to the sky. They almost look fake, he said, don't they? Lucy followed his gaze. The stars, she asked? But he didn't answer. He was thinking of the ones on the ceiling of his bedroom back home. Little pieces of plastic that glowed green in the dark. His mother had put them up when he was little. When Owen first became obsessed with the sky, spending summer nights on his back in the front yard, staring up at the scattering of lights until his eyes burned. They bought him a telescope and they bought him binoculars. They even bought him a globe that showed all the constellations. But in the end, the only way to convince him to go to bed were those glowing plastic stars, which his mother tacked up on the ceiling herself. They're not in the right places, Owen had said that first night, his eyes pinned above him as he climbed into bed. Sure they are, she told him. It's just that these are very rare constellations. He frowned up at them. What are they called? Well, she'd said, scooting in to him. It was scooting in next to him and pointing at the ceiling. That's Owen Major. He let his head fall to the side so that it was resting on her shoulder, and in the dark his voice was hushed. Is there an Owen Minor? Sure, she said, right over there. And that's Buckley's belt. Like Orion's belt? Even better, she said, because you can always see it every single night. Now beside him on the roof, he could still feel Lucy smiling. They don't look fake at all, she said. They look real, really real. They might be the realest thing I've ever seen. Owen smiled too, letting his eyes fall shut, but he could still see them, glowing bright against the backs of his eyelids. For the first time in weeks, he felt all lit up inside, even on this darkest of nights. That's the end of chapter 4. Thanks for watching.